All right, so now we're going to look at how do biologists study green algae and land plants. So we're looking at how they study green algae and land plants. So to look at that, they use morphological traits, they use the fossil record, and they also use phylogenetic trees. So when they're looking at green algae, so green algae includes species that can be either unicellular or multicellular. They can be colonial, they can live in water environments like marine environments or freshwater habitats, but the majority of them are aquatic. Mhm. And the majority of land plants are terrestrial. So freshwater green algae are hypothesized to be closely related to land plants. And some of the reasons that they're thought to be related are because of some of the traits that they have. So both of these have a chloroplast that has a a structure that's the same. So they have thylakoid arrangements that are similar. Thylakoids are structures that are found within the chloroplast. Okay. The cell walls, sperm, and peroxisomes are similar in structure and composition. And also the chloroplast synthesize starch in both green algae and land plants. So of the green algal groups, the three most similar to land plants are the Zygnematophyceae, which are conjugating algae, the Coleochaetophyceae, the coleochaetes or coleochaetes, and the Charophyceae, the stoneworts. So this is all based on DNA analysis. So these are largely multicellular and they live in freshwater. And so the hypothesis is that land plants evolved from green algae that lived in freshwater habitats. So here we can see these examples. Here's a Zygnematophyceae conjugating algae, okay, and the other two, the stoneworts, the coleochaetes. So now some of the major morphological differences among land plants. So to start off, we're going to start with the group of non-vascular plants. So the non-vascular plants, these are plants that don't have vascular tissue. Okay? So the vascular tissue are specialized groups of cells that allow the plant to conduct water from the roots to the rest of the plant or to move nutrients from the either the roots to the rest of the plant or sugars from the leaves to the rest of the plant. So this includes things like mosses um, and liverworts. Okay, so things that we looked at in lab. And these use spores, not seeds, for reproduction and dispersal. The other major group of plants are the seedless vascular plants. So these do have the vascular tissue, but they don't make seeds, and they also use spores for reproduction. And some of these include things like ferns, horsetails, okay, and club mosses. The next group are seed plants. So these have vascular tissue, they make seeds, okay? And this includes the angiosperms, which make the encased seeds. Okay? They're also known as the flowering plants. And then the gymnosperms, which make the naked seeds. Okay, so pretty much when you're thinking of angiosperms, you're thinking of plants or trees that produce fruits. Uh, a lot of the gymnosperms would be things like that produce things like nuts or acorns. So now the other way that they study green algae and land plants is using the fossil record. So the fossil record shows that green algae uh, begins or shows up around 700 million years ago. And land plants show up about 475 million years ago. So because there's a big difference in when they show up in the fossil record, it supports the hypothesis that land plants derived from green algae. Now we're going to look at some of the major events in the diversification of land plants. Okay. So this is divided into 5 major intervals. So it begins here at 475 million years ago with the origin of land plants. Okay. Then when you move into the Silurian Devonian explosion, this is where you start to see the major morphological innovations that plants acquired or developed in order to survive on land. Okay. And then when we move on to the Carboniferous period, this is where a lot of the coal forming swamps uh, occurred. So during this period, there was a lot of swampy areas, a lot of boggy areas, and a lot of the plants that were present at this time were mainly seedless plants. So like horsetails, club mosses, and ferns. Okay. And then we have the diversification of gymnosperms. So here's where the first plants with seeds and pollen began to uh, spread out. So now they weren't just limited to wet environments. They were now present in dry environments. Okay. And then we have the diversification of angiosperms, which is still occurring. Okay. So these are flowering plants with both flowers and fruits. So the plant fossil record is massive. Okay. So as we saw, there's 5 time intervals. The oldest interval begins at 475 million years ago. Here, most of the earliest plant fossils, or most of the earliest plant fossils, are microscopic. So they include things like the cuticle of a plant. The cuticle is just the outermost layer of a plant, or it could be things like spores that are found. Okay. There's also some of the fossilized spores that are found are in association with spore producing structures like sporangia or sporangium if you're just talking about one. And these are similar to the sporangia and some of the modern non-vascular plants. In the Silurian Devonian explosion, which is the second major interval, so these rocks are dated from 416 to 359 million years ago. And so, like I mentioned, virtually all adaptations that allow plants to occupy dry and terrestrial habitats are present during this period. And you can also see that plants colonize land with the aid of fungi. So, because of their symbiotic relationship with fungi, that allowed them to establish better roots and fix nitrogen in those roots or take in nitrogen. Okay. And then the Carboniferous period, the third interval. So, here you can see that extensive deposits of coal were formed in the sediments. Okay. And that's made from the carbon rich rock that's packed with spores, branches, leaves, tree trunks, or other plant material. And because at this time there's more diversity of the seedless vascular plants, most of the fossils were from seedless vascular plants. Okay. But these back then they were a lot bigger than the ones that are found today. So because there was more diversity during this time, some of those seedless vascular plants were either as big as shrubs or even trees. And we have the diversification of gymnosperms in the fourth interval. So some of the major groups of gymnosperms that are alive today are things like ginkgos, redwoods, junipers, yews. Then we have like the pines and the spruces. And these you can find readily in dry environments. Then the fifth interval, this is where the age of flowering plants, so the angiosperms. So these appear about 150 million years ago, and these were the plants that produced the first flowers. And so these are the ancestors of today's, grasses, orchids, oaks. So pretty much when you walk around campus, I would say the vast majority of the trees and plants that you see are going to be angiosperms. There might be a couple of gymnosperms, so maybe like a pine here or there, and maybe some ferns, but I would say like 97% of all the plants and trees around campus are angiosperms, as far as I could tell. Maybe I haven't been to every single part of the campus. So these produce pollen grains that are transported either by wind or insects, because a lot of the insects, and also there are some mammals and birds that also pollinate, but the majority of the pollination is done by insects, like flies, bees, moths, butterflies. So the phylogenetic tree of green plants shows that green plants are a monophyletic group. So they have a single common ancestor that gave rise to all the green plants and the land plants. So remember that in order to be considered a monophyletic group, when you have a common ancestor, you have to include all the descendants. Okay. Green algae on their own, so when you look at the group as on its own, these are considered paraphyletic. Okay. Because it includes because green algae includes some but not all of the descendants of a single common ancestor. Zygonomatophyceae are the closest living things to land plants. Okay, these are plants that evolved from multicellular green algae that lived in freshwater environments. And then land plants on their own are monophyletic. And this shows that there was only one successful transition from freshwater environments to land. And then when you look at non-vascular plants, which are the earliest, uh, more ancestral group of land plants, these are paraphyletic because, again, they include some but not all the descendants of a common ancestor. Then when you look at the seedless vascular plants, these are also paraphyletic. But when you look at vascular plants as a whole, they're monophyletic, which shows that the vascular tissue evolved only once. So just to be clear, the seedless vascular plants are the ones that are paraphyletic. Okay. But when you're just describing the vascular plants as a whole, then they're monophyletic. Seed plants are also monophyletic. So when you look at gymnosperms and angiosperms, those are a monophyletic group, which shows that the seed evolved only once. Okay. So among the seed plants, there was a major divergence in seed development. So here's a phylogenetic tree. So if we look at some of the examples that we went over, so it says that seedless plants are paraphyletic, but vascular plants as a whole are monophyletic. So here's the seedless plants. Okay, so the seedless vascular plants are a paraphyletic group because if you look at the lineages, they don't all come from one common ancestor. So Lycophyta, that has a different common ancestor than these three, the ferns, horsetails, and wisp ferns. Okay, so because they don't all come from the same common ancestor, they're considered paraphyletic. But if you're just talking about vascular plants as a whole, so including the seedless plants and the seed plants, then they're monophyletic because the vascular tissue evolved only once here, and that includes all of these lineages. So every single one of them has vascular tissue. So that's why it's considered monophyletic when you're looking at the vascular plants as a whole. But if you're looking at the seedless vascular plants, so the seedless plants are considered paraphyletic because they don't come from a single common ancestor. Okay. All right. So we'll pause there and then we'll continue on the next one.